Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. It is a pleasure to introduce 10 reports on a range of thematic issues to be considered under items 2 and 3. First, I would like to start with OHCHR oral report to the Human Rights Council on the implementation of the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy across OHCHR's programs and operations, pursuant to Resolution 55/8. As reported to the Secretary General, OHCHR has improved its performance regarding the indicator on strategic planning. We are now exceeding requirements in this area with the development of the OHCHR management plan. Regarding the remainder of the strategy, OHCHR has maintained prior performance levels. We continue to exceed requirements on indicators related to leadership, disability-specific policy, evaluation, reasonable accommodation, and joint initiatives. OHCHR senior management continues to actively champion disability inclusion and will explore more systemic means to increase engagement. OHCHR Disability Rights Strategy and its annual work plans continue to guide strategic action and implementation of UNDIS. OHCHR continues to work with other UN entities, including ILO, UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, and UN Women. The most recent joint initiatives focus on care and support initiatives. We continue to meet requirements in the areas of institutional setup as well as capacity development. OHCHR ability to enhance its performance under the UNDIS framework is primarily hindered by limited resources, which affect several critical areas. The postponement of key meetings related to institutional setups, such as those involving disability focal points across all OHCHR field operations, highlights capacity constraints. Accessibility assessment at duty stations remain incomplete due to logistical and financial hurdles. While formal benchmarks have been met in some areas, systemic constraints across the UN continue to limit the effective and timely provision of reasonable accommodation and advanced performance under the indicator related to employment. In-depth analysis of the performance can be found in the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy report, which is available on our website, including an easy-to-read version of the report. Based on the findings presented, it is evident that our current resources and capacities are effectively utilized to their maximum to uphold performance across most indicators and enhance it in one of them. It is worth noting that to sustain and further improve our performance, additional resources and enhanced capacity are necessary. This would enable us to effectively address the areas where further improvements are needed and ensure continued progress across all indicators. Next, I would like to turn to the report of the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women on the activities of the United Nations Trust Fund in support of actions to eliminate violence against women, prepared for the Commission on the Status of Women and the Human Rights Council, which I am presenting on behalf of UN Women. HRC 59/21. The report highlights the Trust Fund's impact, achievements, and challenges in its mission to eliminate violence against women and girls globally. Established in 1996 and managed by UN Women, the Trust Fund is the only global multilateral grant-making mechanism dedicated to this cause. The UN Trust Fund contributes to most of the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG 5. and is an integral part of the UN Women's Strategic Plan for the period 2022-2025, especially its goal to end all forms of violence against women and girls. The UN Trust Fund was created by General Assembly Resolution 50/166 in response to the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, through which it is mandated to report on its activities to the Commission on the Status of Women and the Human Rights Council on an annual basis. In 2024, the Trust Fund managed $87.5 million grant for portfolio across 180 civil society organizations in 74 countries, with 69% being women's rights organizations. It awarded $15.9 million in new grants to 36 initiatives in 41 countries through its general window. This is a special funding window to address violence against women and girls affected by crisis, and through its advocacy, coalition building, and transformative feminist action to end violence against women, ACT program, for grants supporting regional initiatives to strengthen networks and movements focused on ending violence against women and girls. The report highlights the achievement of grantee partners across the three thematic outcomes of the UN Trust Fund Strategic Plan 21-25, namely improved access to multi-sectoral services, prevention of violence, and strengthening the implementation of law, policies, and national action plans. It highlights the critical role played by civil society and women's rights organizations, who form the bedrock of efforts to end violence against women and girls. Despite progress, the report underscores growing threats, including increasing risk of violence through crisis, pushback against gender equality, and tech-facilitated violence against women and girls. The Trust Fund responded in 2024 by improving its wraparound service and grant-making model, extending grant duration, increasing self and collective care allocations, and allocating contingency and capacity development budgets to foster organizational resilience. It intensified collaboration across the UN system and with strategic partners to advocate for increased direct funding for women organizations' work to end violence against women and girls, and continued its efforts to co-curate practice-based knowledge with its grantee partners. Entering the final year of its 2021 to 2025 strategic plan and approaching its 30th anniversary, the Fund will consolidate its efforts, amplify its impact to continue to build a world in which each woman and girl can live free from violence, seeking to ensure that no one is left behind across the humanitarian development peace nexus. I now turn to OHCHR comprehensive report on access to medicines, vaccines, and other health products in the context of the right to highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, which was submitted pursuant to Council Resolution 5013. The report is the outcome of a 3-year mandate, including 3 expert workshops, as well as a compendium of good practices under reference A HRC5350 and analytical study A HRC5628, which have already been submitted to this Council. This comprehensive report highlights key challenges in ensuring access to medicines, vaccines, and other health products, including for specific groups, in emergency situations and systemic barriers, and outlines a human rights-based approach to ensuring such access as part of realizing the right to health. A key recommendation is for states to adopt comprehensive national policies focused on enhancing access to medicines, including by ensuring universal health coverage, which prioritizes at-risk persons and populations in situations of marginalization and which cover the entire life cycle of medicines, from medical innovation to distribution. The report also underscores the importance of advancing international human rights-anchored governance on the use of artificial intelligence and other digital technologies such as data systems, algorithmic decision-making, or telemedicine in public health, as well as the urgency of establishing robust mechanisms for the prevention, monitoring, and accountability of attacks on healthcare facilities, providers, and personnel during armed conflicts. The report also highlights the potential of leveraging regional cooperation to enhance access and the important role that regional organizations can play. Next, I would like to draw your attention to OHCHR report on accelerating efforts to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls, preventing and responding to all forms of violence against women and girls in criminal justice detention, HRC59 Many women are detained for non-violent, poverty-related crimes or discriminatory offenses linked to life-sustaining activities on the street. The absence of safe and accessible housing often prevents women from escaping violence, perpetuating a cycle of violence, poverty, and criminalization. In detention, facilities are often designed for men and fail to meet women's specific needs, especially access to health care, menstrual hygiene, nutritious food, and safe environments. Pregnant and breastfeeding women, as well as those with children, face heightened risks due to insufficient support and separation from families. Gender-based violence is widespread, including physical, sexual, and psychological abuse from staff and inmates, exacerbated by overcrowding, inadequate access to justice, the use of pretrial detention, inadequate monitoring and complaints mechanisms, supervision by male staff, and lack of non-custodial measures. The report highlights the importance of those non-custodial measures that take into account the specific needs and circumstances of women, gender-sensitive legal aid, and independent oversight. It calls for reforms to discriminatory laws, improved detention conditions, and comprehensive rehabilitation programs. Special attention is given to pregnant, postpartum, and breastfeeding women, mothers with children in prison, LGBTIQ+ detainees who face heightened vulnerabilities. Ultimately, the report advocates for a multifaceted, rights-based approach to prevent and address violence against women in detention, emphasizing dignity, safety, and successful reintegration into society. I'm now pleased to present the OHCHR report on the practical application of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights on challenges, good practices, and lessons learned in applying the guiding principles to the activities of technology companies, including activities relating to artificial intelligence. Reference A, HRC 5932. In the face of rapid AI developments that present both transformative opportunities and significant risks to human rights, embedding human rights throughout the AI lifecycle is essential to ensure a responsible AI innovation ecosystem that benefits humanity. The report highlights how the guiding principles on business and human rights offer critical support to both state regulators and companies in answering that challenge while preventing and mitigating the substantial risks it poses. Companies developing or deploying AI have a responsibility to respect human rights, as outlined in the UN Guiding Principles, not only by avoiding harm, but by actively working to prevent or mitigate any human rights risk connected to their technologies, including those arising from partners or end users. This requires human rights due diligence, a continuous process that includes identifying risks, integrating safeguards into operations, acting to prevent harm, and being transparent about their efforts. In the context of AI, this due diligence must be early, ongoing, and context-specific, especially given the unpredictable impacts of the new technologies like generative AI. Stakeholder engagement that is local, inclusive, and sustained is crucial. AI developers and deployers should consult those potentially affected by their systems, especially marginalized groups, and respond to their feedback meaningfully. Regarding the duty of states to protect individuals from AI-related abuses, the report lays out how a smart mix of regulatory and policy measures can be applied to align corporate conduct with human rights. This should integrate human rights due diligence into AI regulations and ensure policy coherence across national and global levels. AI regulation should apply across public and private sectors, emphasize transparency, accountability, data protection, and ensure companies assess and mitigate risks through the entire AI lifecycle. Policy measures such as funding AI aligned with public interest goals, integrating human rights into national AI strategies, and embedding requirements in public procurement can also play a key role. Governments can also influence conduct through development, finance, and technical standard-setting bodies to help translate human rights into technical AI standards. Effective judicial and non-judicial mechanisms are critical from redressing AI-related harms. Transparency, explainability, and technical expertise are key to making remedies accessible and meaningful. Systemic inequalities heighten the impact of AI on women, girls, and marginalized groups, requiring specific policy and gender-sensitive assessment to mitigate these risks. Investors play a key role in driving corporate respect for human rights by incorporating human rights-based criteria into investment decisions and engaging with companies on their AI practices. While some progress has been made, the report calls for coordinated global efforts to ensure AI technologies uphold human rights dignity and rights. It provides actionable recommendations and identifies areas for further work, including by this Council. The next report I would like to present to you is OHCHR report on accessible, inclusive, equitable, and quality education for peace and tolerance for every child, especially children in the most vulnerable situation. The report is submitted pursuant to Resolution 54.5. The report focuses on the importance of establishing elements of education systems that promote social cohesion. Educational systems that do not provide children with child rights-centric education, grounded on the principles of non-discrimination, gender equality, inclusivity, and cultural relevance, seriously undermine children's enjoyment of their human rights, exposing them to human rights violations and abuses. Any failure in this critical area poses a serious risk of fostering group disenfranchisement, disrupting societal cohesion, and compromising sustained economic growth. Particular attention must be given to children from marginalized groups, children affected by armed conflict, and children associated or allegedly associated with armed forces and non-state armed groups as they face aggravated risks. The report sets out promising practices demonstrating how states have developed and implemented child rights-centered education systems aimed at promoting and creating conditions for peace and tolerance. Member states are encouraged to strengthen legal and policy frameworks to guarantee the right to accessible, inclusive, equitable, and quality education at all levels, from pre-primary through secondary education in both formal and informal educational settings, and ensure sustainable funding for the implementation of such frameworks. I now turn to the High Commission's report on implementation and enhancement of international cooperation in the field of human rights. 5936. The report focuses on financing for development within the broader scope of the mandate with a view to making a human rights contribution to the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which takes place this week. There is a growing financial gap for realizing the Sustainable Development Goals and an urgent need for a robust global financing framework anchored in human rights. The report reviewed the evolution of the International Financing for Development framework leading up to the adoption of the Pact for the Future in September last year, where member states reaffirmed their commitment to the 2030 agenda centered on the eradication of poverty. OHCHR engagement on global financing for development agenda includes its contribution to the preparatory process of FFD4, particularly through inputs to the co-facilitator elements paper and the zero draft document, as well as the issuance of 3 policy briefs, advocating for the inclusion of ambitious human rights perspective in the process. OHCHR other activities in relation to financing for development during the reporting period from 1st of April last year to 31st March 25 are presented in the light of the 7 action areas listed in the Addis Ababa agenda. These activities include seminars, capacity building, research, and consultancy programs carried out in cooperation with a variety of stakeholders. The report concludes that on the occasion of this conference, states and other stakeholders must stand firm on the human rights principle of the Addis Ababa agenda and advance the powerful alignment of human rights and financing for development. This includes meeting the development cooperation target, increased investment in human rights through more equitable and effective taxation, responsible business aligned with human rights principles, equitable share of trade benefits, sustainable debt, and a fairer global economic governance and financing framework, all contributing to a more equitable global economic system in which no country and no person is left behind. Next, I turn to the High Commission's reports on child rights mainstreaming across the United Nations. Reference 59/38. The report highlights a critical imperative. As children constitute 1/3 of our global population and face unprecedented challenges that demand an urgent coordinated response. Children today face significant shortfalls and challenges to their rights in multiple respects. 333 million children survive on less than $2.15 daily, while an estimated 1.3 billion children in developing countries are affected by multidimensional poverty, lacking access to essential services. An estimated 4.8 million children under age 5 died from preventable causes in 2023, while 202 million children under 5 live in severe food poverty. Education remains out of reach for 244 million children, in particular in conflict-affected areas. More than 2/3 of school-age children globally still lack internet access at home. Over 473 million children, more than 1 in 6 globally, live in areas affected by conflict, with 32,000 grave violations against children verified in 26 conflict zones only in 2023. The 2023 guidance notes on child rights mainstreaming provides our roadmap, establishing that all United Nations entities have a role in implementing the Convention on the Right of the Child. This comprehensive framework integrates child rights across peace, security, human rights, and development pillars, not as separate initiative, but embedded within existing UN operations. OHCHR and UNICEF jointly coordinate implementation through an interagency task team, focusing on child participation, safeguarding, and capacity building. Encouraging examples emerge across entities. For example, ILO Global Campaign Against Child Labor, UNODC's strategy to end violence against children, and UNEP's integration of child rights into environmental advocacy. Despite progress, barriers remain. Integration into strategic frameworks varies across entities. Coordination mechanisms need to be strengthened further, and country-level implementation requires development. Addressing these areas through systematic approaches would support more effective integration of child rights across the UN system. The full operationalization of the guidance notes presents a significant opportunity to advance children's rights globally and contribute to achieving the SDGs and the Pact of the Future. The report identifies opportunities to integrate child rights more effectively into core UN frameworks, accelerate cooperation among entities and country level, strengthen institutional efforts, enhance coordination and collaboration, and support country programs with appropriate tools and guidance. I now turn to the High Commission's report on the impact of civilian acquisition, possession, and use of firearms and underlying root causes and risk factors driving firearms-related violence on the right to participate in cultural life and the right to take part in the conduct of public affairs. 59/39. The civilian use of firearms affects the enjoyment of the rights to take part in the conduct of public affairs and participate in cultural life in several ways. Firearms are used to conduct targeted attacks against individuals because of or to prevent the exercise of those rights. Victims include politicians, human rights defenders, environmental and land rights defenders, suffering very high rates of killings, and investigative journalists, including those covering corruption and organized crime. Communities, too, are affected by targeted attacks, as witnessed during ethnic conflicts and in settler violence, as well as mass shootings and violence targeting ethnic, racial, and religious groups, as well as individuals based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. High rates of firearms violence in society more generally can also negatively affect the enjoyment of rights, leading individuals to limit their participation in cultural life and taking part in public affairs to minimize the risk of victimization and leading to displacement. Civilian-held firearms in public places, even when lawful, can also have a chilling effect on the exercise of rights, including the rights to peaceful assembly. In its conclusion and recommendation, the report emphasized the need for states to take comprehensive measures to protect individuals and groups from firearms violence. It stresses the importance of adhering to international human rights law, particularly in terms of derogations, use of force, and fair trial standards, and recommends adopting protective measures for those facing specific threats or recurring violence partners, and allocating resources to law enforcement for effective investigation, prosecution, and accountability of firearms-related violence. To prevent firearms violence, the report recommends developing context-sensitive policy responses from stakeholder participation, addressing inequality and discrimination, and tackling grievances that may lead to violence. It further recommends implementing community-based initiatives and interventions like violence interruption programs and local mediation initiatives, and taking measures to address cultural notions of masculinity that contribute to firearms violence. Finally, it urges strengthening the rule of law, especially through combating corruption in law enforcement, justice, and local government services. The last report that I would like to introduce is the OHCHR study on the use of digital technologies to achieve universal birth registration, reference 59/61. The report examines current efforts to achieve universal birth registration, including using digital technologies, best practices, challenges and opportunities, and potential mechanisms to close the gap between the number of children whose births are reported as registered and those who actually have a birth certificate. 150 million children under the age of 5 globally have never had their births recorded. The study highlights the systemic and structural barriers children and their parents or caregivers face to accessing birth registration and birth certificates. These barriers include discriminatory laws, policy and practices, affordability and accessibility, lack of awareness, and human rights challenges associated with digitalization. The study sets out a model to achieve universal birth registration, including by using digital technologies through a sustainable, hybrid, integrated system approach that is grounded in the rights of the child and provides recommendations to states and the private sector on how to implement this approach. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.